Hi, I'm Tanvi, and together with my friend Nia, we've started a newsletter called the Parallel Campaign, which takes a historical lens on sort of contemporary political and cultural issues in India today. And the newsletter was motivated by very similar themes to the ones that Julia and her team and this group have been talking about for a while, of isolation and exclusion. Because it seemed to us for some time now that in many places in the world, but especially India, we're both Indian, the idea of the nation, which is typically understood to be an inclusive, sort of expansive concept across shared time and space, of coming together, has been turned into an instrument to isolate and often deliberately exclude people. And we wanted to understand how it was that national identity came to be understood in such exclusionary terms rather than terms of belonging. So for instance, in India, even though the constitution guarantees certain fundamental rights to every citizen, who is understood to be entitled to these rights, deserving of these rights and legal protections, we think is often based on frameworks of national belonging and nationalism rather than legal ones, which is how you end up in a situation like the one that we had in India around this time last year, where Indian citizens who were protesting against proposed legislation on the grounds that it was unconstitutional. So you have citizens marching in the street, quoting from the Constitution, the very thing that is the basis of this republic, who were accused by the government of being anti-nationals. They were accused of sedition, of working to subvert the very integrity of India. And this distinction between who is a citizen and who is a national justifies itself by turning to history. At its heart, it's based on a conception of a national that's sort of tied to some historical understanding of what it means to be authentically Indian. And it's often tied to these notions of capturing lost glory, making things great again. Who was here first? How have these things always been done? It's true not just in India, but elsewhere in the world as well. Nia and I always say there's that old saying that the past is a foreign country. But often when you look at how history is used in service of national agendas, it's clear that even though it's a foreign country, the past has the power to deport people from the present. And how is it that the government employs history to service its national agenda, right? They can't change what actually happened in the Indian past, but they can control what people know about it, especially in India. There's a reason that one of the first things that regimes and governments across the world do when they come into power is change school history textbooks. And certainly in India, that's something this current government has taken to doing with some gusto. And those protests that happened last year were sort of very quickly discontinued because of the pandemic. And I think on a personal level, that inability to be part of that collective movement, to be out there protesting on the street, reiterated to me this weird mix of having privilege as a citizen of this nation, but also being powerless about who got to call themselves a national, right? Like I didn't know how to balance those two things. And the newsletter is a very limited attempt to challenge other people's control of those historical narratives. And we don't have any illusions about what it's going to achieve. There are far more urgent demands being placed on the nation's attention, but we think this is important to do sort of alongside conceptually to limit the power of nationalism to isolate and exclude
people. So when Tanvi approached me with her ideas about this newsletter, I was instantly interested because, well, Tanvi and I grew up as family friends and debate rivals in school. And we remember being at the same parties and the sort of same gatherings and being inevitably drawn, both of us, into these wonderfully imprecise, impressionistic arguments over rum and coke between these old, seemingly venerable uncles who were fighting about, what was wrong with the country, over how society and politics and the economy and the nation could fix itself. And we remember being so aware, especially as we got to high school, that so much of this bold talk was based not much more than, personal prejudice and a passing familiarity with whatever the newspapers said was the scandal of the day. But we were still nonetheless always impressed by the performance of wisdom and the sort of projection of authority that these uncles achieved that made a room listen. And what was it that made these men, and they were really overwhelmingly men, so sure that they were right? And it was that memory of going up against that sort of disdainful sureness, which was really a front for actual powerlessness and uncertainty, that drew me to this project when Tanvi approached me. And this is an interesting question right now, because as Tanvi said, control over narratives of history is so crucial to constructions of national identity. And because of that, India is steadily becoming a very dangerous place in which to contradict the government's narrative of national history. And as an upper caste woman doing a PhD in history in the United States, I've had sort of systemic privileges that have largely insulated me from these excesses. But the consequences of seemingly really innocuous actions for people with less distance between themselves and state authority, or who have greater reach amongst the public, or who have less social and cultural privilege, is far worse. And as Tanvi said, the government is changing school textbooks. In addition, academics, especially historians, are being hounded and even arrested for their scholarship, when it seems like that scholarship is inconvenient. And really the identities of those who are being persecuted and harassed seems to indicate a concerted attempt to consolidate scholarly authority in the hands of mostly upper caste, upper class Hindu men with right-wing views. And we've seen many examples throughout the years, since 2014, especially on a spectrum from campaigns of online harassment to outright arrest and prosecution. And the bulk has fallen overwhelmingly on oppressed caste and Muslim citizens. The story of the Indian university student Sharjeel Imam is an interesting one for us especially, and we think it's emblematic because it showcases how sort of direct and unmediated speech, a citizen saying exactly what you want, what you think, has become treasonous if you belong to a certain marginalized identity, even if your words did not instigate violence of any kind. And we had an especially graphic illustration of this when we cited the books of Paul Brass, a respected political scientist who studies collective violence, in our own newsletters and issues, only to realize, days later that the same books, when they were found in Sharjeel Imam's room when he was arrested, was submitted by the police as evidence that he was a terrorist, because they had no other evidence that he was a terrorist, but this was enough. And a lot of this, this persecution has accelerated under the cover of the pandemic, while the country and human rights organizations have been distracted. And in all of these cases, the defense of so-called national values has been used to silence people who do not see themselves reflected in India's aggressively exclusionary model currently of patriotic citizenship.
Enables this to happen is how history is taught, not just in institutions of higher learning and in scholarly debates, but also in schools, in how it's understood more broadly in public life. And it's taught in terms of authority, of I'll tell you what happened, but with little self-awareness of the fact that anyone looking to the past does so with some hope of indicating their place in the present. So like with those uncles that Nia was talking about, there's a sense of, I have assumed authority to tell you what happened, but that you questioning that is a sign of disrespect. So historical facts exist. There are documents and artifacts that can corroborate these facts, but how these facts are interpreted and placed within larger narratives is rarely beyond question or challenge. Historians, like anyone else, view things through the prisms of their own biases, and national historians particularly so. And yet we are taught all the time that good students, and when we grow up, good Indian citizens, do not question authority because doing so is disrespectful. This combination of reverence and a lack of self-awareness is dangerous. It leads to this performance of nation as a historical debate between great men, and almost always great men. It's a zero-sum game of conquest and achievement. And there's an insistence on valorizing leaders in explicitly martial terms. I mean, this current government especially seems very keen on machismo, which doesn't leave a lot of space for complexity or understanding structural factors, how the actions of these leaders interacted with the fabric of society, the privileges and experiences that led to them adopting certain ideological positions, the institutional constraints within which they operated. and no space at all for non-dominant actors or groups like women, but also other minorities that don't fit this mold of like founding great forefather of the nation. And it leaves no space at all to contend with what these leaders and men did wrong, because somehow we've ended up in a position through teaching history this way where our sense of national self is inherently tied to these men on a pedestal. And what we're trying to do with this newsletter is question how these historical narratives of the nation are constructed so that we can make the idea of patriotism more complex, less martial, by insisting on an awareness of complexity and irreverence without conflating it with disrespect. I would like to be a good Indian citizen, of course, but I would like to be so on my own terms. Loving where you come from, and I do fiercely, doesn't mean that I don't ever get to question it. We want to try and allow for a conception of nationalism that isn't so tied to ideas of achievement and glory, but one that is able to reckon with the frailties of what has happened in the past so that we can do it better. And we want to do it better because we are so invested in the idea of the nation. We love it because it is ours, not because of some reductionist logic of greatness of men that came before us.
And really, in addition to that, the newsletter really is an attempt to directly engage with the problem of public scholarship in an era of global crisis and polarization. In this moment when we're all separated from one another and in these little bubbles, why does it matter to communicate history well? Why does it matter to publicize important and groundbreaking and new scholarship in terms that are accessible and interesting to citizens in the face of this unending, hysterical, amnesiac news cycle? The tools and skills that historical thinking gives us, we strongly believe are unique because they allow us to see politics and current affairs and what's happening now and the possible futures of our society in ways that are both empirical and speculative. Historical thinking, when it is taught well, sort of allows us to ask what is required to imagine a free state for ourselves and for our societies. History can be made inclusive for people in this way, in ways other than just tokenistically including figures from different backgrounds. Oh, here's a token woman, here's a token minority, in ways that evacuate these people from the specificity of their context. It's important to question the gender of the protagonist of history. It's important to ask what it means to admit different sorts of historical actors and shine the spotlight on them, really often for the first time. Just as it is important to show how historical movements that did not see themselves as nationalistic played a huge role in India's history, in global history, and in the framing of our constitutions and our political arrangements. And plenty of commentators, and really good ones, are pushing at these new interpretations of history. And we do this too because, that's just what telling history is. But we try to be interested above all in generating conversation about what it means to do history instead of being told what history is. And this is really, really important because history can hold out the possibility of different and new and freeing forms of association and solidarity and belonging to people who are constantly forced to frame their identity first and foremost as allegiance or assimilation to a particular nation or national values. Having the vocabulary to contest someone's characterization of you is extremely important. And this is something that we've been thinking about for a really long time, and we're hoping to contribute to that.
Yeah, so with the newsletter, as Nia said, we're trying to pry open these historical spaces and conceptions of nation, because we think that in so doing, the nation benefits by being more accommodating with diversity and nuance. And it's our normative bias that this is a valuable thing in and of itself. But also, given that the nation is the hegemonic form within which we are situated, it's the site of our citizenship and the rights that come from it, it's also a key part of all of our personal identities. It's important to think about what this kind of alienation and isolation does to our ability to feel more at home in our own homes. Any conception of nationalism that insists on what it means to be an ideal Indian doesn't do it in ungendered terms. It carries with it a conception of what it means to be an ideal Indian man, what it means to be an ideal Indian woman. And it's very binary and prescriptive about these things and makes it very difficult for you to challenge others other people's conceptions of what it means to be a woman or a minority, or however it is that you choose to identify yourself, which in turn, I think, informs our ability to participate in public life, to be part of debates about legislation and policies that affect us as citizens, as women, as however it is that, whichever bits of our identity are activated in respect to that. And it's important to pry open these spaces, not just from the point of view of what it means for the nation, but what it means for our ability to participate in our own public welfare. I think it's also important to generate this sort of cross-cutting solidarity, as Nia said, from a global perspective, because so many of our future present challenges are questions of collective action, climate change being the most prominent example. How do you make the idea of the nation that less tied to the great men that are on these pedestals, and therefore more secure and able to participate in the transnational and the international without feeling like it's giving something of itself away, where compromises are not seen as defeat or victory, but instead the negotiations inherent to being part of a shared project. And that's why we think that challenging these historical constructions of nations through our newsletter is something worth